All right, we're gonna start. So welcome everyone to this webinar on acceptance, past, present, and future. My name is Leah Mutar and I'm research advisor at the Global Interagency Security Forum, also called GISF, which is shorter. So just before we start, I'm gonna go over a few household rules and technical settings. So this webinar is going to be recorded. If you wish to watch it again, you will be able to do so in the weeks following the webinar. You will be able to ask questions during the webinar. Please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen, and don't put your question in the chat function, otherwise we may risk missing them. In the Q&A function, you have the possibility to upvote questions. So this will help us prioritize which question to ask first. There will also be some polls which will be asked throughout the webinar. This is very self-explanatory, so I don't think anyone is going to have any issue with them, but if you do so, please contact Laura or Tara, which are our GISF project and memberships officers. And there will also be a poll at the end, so we can get your feedback on this event and learn how to improve our future events. So please do engage with us on all these functions and questions. During the webinar, also don't hesitate to share your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag GISF acceptance. This appears at the bottom of the screen if you can see it. And finally, as we start this call, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat function and share one word that comes to your mind when you think of acceptance. I've already seen that there are a couple of words such as collaboration, complicated, essential, fragile. So this promises to be an interesting conversation. Moving on to more the actual content of the webinar. So acceptance is said by most NGOs to be their primary security risk management strategy. However, it hasn't been very much explored in research nor in literature. And there are still many, many questions around what exactly acceptance is, how to earn it, how to analyze it, and how to maintain it. The topic is very wide. It overlaps with access, negotiation, communication. It is also impacted by so many elements such as the urbanization of crisis, counterterrorism legislations, evolution technology, but also the humanitarian peace and development nexus. It's both a complex and important subject to explore, and that is why GISF is looking to start a research project to better investigate it and seize all the stakes of acceptance. In the autumn, we will therefore look to compile different articles that investigate different angles of acceptance. It's going to be in the format that resembles our communication and technology paper for those who know it. And my colleagues are going to share a link towards it in the chat, so you can have a look at it if you're interested. So this webinar is an opportunity for us to start conversations around acceptance and also to get a sense of your idea and priorities in terms of acceptance. So all your questions and discussions are going to help us to shape the next stages of the project. And we therefore hope you will engage through the chat and different functions and really share your thoughts with us. We also have a great panel with us today to start. So we have Larissa, who is a senior lecturer in humanitarian studies at the University of Manchester's in the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. Larissa has worked at the intersection of the worlds of academia, policy, and practice for over 2 decades as an academic and working for both government and non-governmental organizations. Her research addresses 2 fundamental problems: how best to protect civilians, particularly those who intervene in violent conflict, and how to make such intervention more effective, ethical, and responsive to local needs and circumstances. In addition to her book, Aid in Danger, The Perils and Promises of Humanitarianism, she has published more than a dozen peer-reviewed articles and policy reports. And Larissa has been one of the lead researchers on a research project on acceptance, which she will talk to us about in a few minutes. And then we also have Hugo, whose last name I'm going to pronounce atrociously badly, and I really apologize for it. Hugo van der Eertwegh. You can correct me as soon as you have the opportunity to speak, who is the head of the ICRC's Security and Crisis Management Support Unit. Hugo supports ICRC's worldwide operation from the HQ in Geneva in managing security risk and major operational crises. Hugo has worked in the humanitarian field with ICRC since 2000, including 12 years in various operational countries and contexts. So in the session today, we will first hear from our two speakers. There will be time for a few questions after each presentation. Then we will move on to a panel discussion. And we should have a bit more than 30 minutes at the end to just answer questions from the audience. So once again, don't hesitate to ask anything that crosses your mind. And Larissa, I will hand over to you now.
Okay, great. Thanks for the invitation to speak about some research that, well, at this point, it was a bit of a shock to realize that it took place almost 10 years ago when colleagues and I from Save the Children and Johns Hopkins undertook a 2-year research project to look at the question of what is acceptance. So it was a project funded by OFDA, and we essentially had 4 fundamental questions. The first was, what is acceptance? The second was, how do organizations gain and maintain acceptance? The third was, how do organizations monitor the presence and degree of acceptance? And then finally, how do they assess its effectiveness? So we did, I guess, consult and collaborate broadly in the field research in East Africa, in Uganda and South Sudan and in Kenya, which a lot of people asked us why those countries, which in some ways limits the generalizability in terms of finding. They were not necessarily at the time in 2010, 2011. None of them were active conflict zones, but it's also difficult, as many of you know much better than I, how difficult it is to gain acceptance in active conflict. It's not to say it doesn't happen, because it does. But nevertheless, we chose to focus on more about the process rather than what organizations do, rather than some of the specifics about, say, humanitarian negotiation, for example. So we produced both individual country studies as well as a synthesis report. And then we revised that and published it as a journal article in 2015. So I'm going to go over some of the main findings of the research pretty quickly, but never fear. It's all written down, and we published everything. We made it publicly available to everyone, to anyone, at a website, which I think EISF can post in the chat in case anyone wants to take a look. So our working definition of acceptance was that it's founded on effective relationships and cultivating and maintaining consent from beneficiaries, local authorities, belligerents, and other stakeholders. This, in turn, is a means of reducing or removing potential threats in order to access vulnerable populations and undertake program activities. So one of our main findings is that was that acceptance has to be a program strategy as well as a security management strategy. So in short, it's cross-cutting, but we found that too often it was separated at an institutional level. So program people saw it as a security thing, and security people didn't always recognize the programmatic dimensions of acceptance. So, you know, the other, I guess, main finding is that it must be deliberate and systematic. It can't be just something that organizations assume they have. So in terms of gaining and maintaining acceptance, I could talk in much more detail, but in the interest of time, I'll just go over some of the programmatic pieces, which were around the type and the quality of programs, whether those programs actually met the needs that communities themselves prioritized, and also how organizations provided the services that they did. Whether it was done in a respectful way, whether it, again, met the needs of the communities. A couple of things that we drew attention to, or we found that needed attention, were things like entry and exit strategies. So how do organizations start up programs in a community, and then how do they exit them? How do they close programs down? Because if you don't sort of enter into a community and sort of gain the consent of key leaders and authority figures, both informal and formal, it can affect your acceptance. In the same way, exit was really crucial. So how do you tell communities that you are closing down a particular program, and why? How do you explain that, and to whom do you do that? And then another aspect of this that goes hand in hand is transparency and accountability. So being transparent with your choices and what you're doing, and then also accountable for those. And both of those were quite important in developing trust with communities. So that was the programmatic side, but there are other things also that affect the degree of acceptance, things like logistics and procurement. Who do you hire to provide your, who do you hire to provide escort if you are traveling? Who do you hire as your kind of security guards for compounds? How do you make those choices? Whose companies do you prioritize for vehicle hires or other kinds of procurement that you might do? Human resources sort of should go without saying, the hiring and firing of people, as well as sort of the composition of your staff. Do they reflect the local community, and in what ways? So questions around diversity in all kinds of ways become important here. Media and communications at both the country level and also the headquarters level were quite important. And then lastly, finance and admin. Even things like the payment of invoices can become ways of either maintaining your acceptance, or more often not maintaining your acceptance, sort of compromising it. So that was gaining and maintaining. So that was our second question. In terms of the degree and the presence of acceptance, we came up with a continuum, which many of you may be familiar with. And we sort of identified different degrees of acceptance, and sort of our strongest. It also generated a lot of discussion and debate, I think, which is good. But our strongest level was endorsement. So stakeholders actively promote and intervene on behalf of the organization to protect its staff, its assets, or its reputation. A second sort of less strong level was consent, where stakeholders provide safe and continued access to vulnerable populations and may also share security-related information. Sort of the mid-range level, stakeholders tolerate the presence of NGOs in the community, in large part because they provide goods and services that stakeholders want and need, or from which they can benefit. Then sort of, and those three levels, we just, it depends on the context, but if you have at least some degree of toleration, or ideally consent and endorsement, your security will be much improved. But if you go into the reject or target range, which are the last two that I'll talk about, that's where acceptance no longer is effective. So when rejection is present, stakeholders undermine NGO programs or access to vulnerable populations. Or if they target, and this is obviously the most problematic, where they actively threaten or attack NGO staff, programs, assets, or reputation. So that's about the presence, but then how do you assess that? How do you monitor the presence? And so we discovered a lot of different mechanisms for doing that, and different ways that NGOs, and we did in the research, we focused mostly on NGOs for reasons that I am happy to talk about. But that's why I keep talking about NGOs now. But I guess the ways through which NGOs gather information about whether and to what extent they have acceptance, and they were usually community-based mechanisms. So things like community feedback, such as complaint boxes or hotlines, informal or formal conversations with community members or leaders. They might also track levels of community engagement or participation in program monitoring. One organization called it a people count. It might also be monitoring the extent to which community members use services as opposed to past use, or tracking beneficiary contributions toward project implementation and success. So the definition of land, help with construction of project buildings, that kind of thing. It might also be about tracking community engagement or commitment to project activities, or discussing the quality of community relations as part of staff meetings on programs or security. But what we also found is that the deliberate monitoring of acceptance didn't always happen. And again, I'm talking 10 years ago, things may have changed, but my guess is perhaps not as much as we would like, although I stand to be challenged on that. Yeah, and it's really crucial. The other side of that is if you are using things like feedback mechanisms, it's really important that the communities themselves actually they are aware of it and they're able to access those feedback mechanisms. Because if you just have them there but no one knows about them, then it defeats the purpose. So indicators of presence. And here we found they generally fell into 4 categories. So you can monitor the presence, but then how do you know what sort of level you're at? And those indicators were sort of at 4 different levels. One was administrative indicators, things like formal documents, like memoranda of understanding, certifications, or formal letters of recognition or introduction. Might have been at the level of programs and access. And so that is, different levels of support from communities. So for example, if roads are impassable, communities might come out to assist an NGO to make sure that staff members could continue their work. Stakeholder participation was another of those, the third one, and it usually referred to levels and types of participation in organizational events. So the kind of thing that I had talked about earlier, about whether local leaders are actively involved, community contributions to projects, even something like the atmosphere at a meeting or at a project. And examples of, presence would be, community members organize meetings to sensitize others about the outside of the community about the presence of the NGO, or that they take a noticeable and positive interest in the work of an organization. And then our 4th one was community requests or actions. So that those signal implicit or explicit endorsement, or they actively seek to protect or advocate on behalf of an organization. So a community might approach an organization asking it to intercede on a local issue, or to they might publicly commit to accept responsibility for staff safety. And then finally, on indicators of effectiveness. So how do we assess whether it might be present, and you might assume that it's present at a high degree, but how do you actually determine whether it's working in a particular context? And here we had 5 indicators of effectiveness, some of which overlapped with our the monitoring of presence. But the first one is that NGOs gain access to program areas or to populations. This might be, it might be one-off, but we found that actually safe and continuous access was more of an indicator of acceptance than just one-time access. A second indicator is that stakeholders share security-related information. So you might receive warnings about impending incidents via text message. That would be the kinds of examples, or a phone call warning you to stay away from a place, or to, perhaps go a different day. The third indicator was that stakeholders advocate on behalf of or promote an NGO. So this is when communities themselves do the work of advocating for the organization or represent its work to others. The fourth was that stakeholders intervene to prevent or resolve an incident. So, for example, they might take actions to assist organizations that experience a security incident, or to resolve a particularly tense or potentially dangerous situation. And then our fifth one was that stakeholders distinguish an NGO and its work, and thereby avoid, mitigate, or resolve an incident. So the difference between 4 and 5 is slight, but it means that the community, the actors, the stakeholders recognize the particular NGO and the resulting action on the part of that community or other stakeholders. So some examples here, an NGO that we found in our research, it came across a hostile demonstration and a crowd was throwing stones at vehicles, but someone from among the demonstrators recognized that particular NGO vehicle, and then it was allowed to pass without further incident. As another example, there was a conflict between two groups in a particular community, and both groups were armed and the military was on standby. And these groups then requested that an NGO intervene to help de-escalate the conflict. And the chiefs then provided security guarantees to ensure that the staff members would be safe. And then a final one, there was an example that we heard about where an NGO vehicle was attacked, and the perpetrators took all of the money and the cell phones that belonged to the passengers. And with the help of the villagers with whom the organization worked, the NGO recovered all of its stolen items except for the cash. So those are the basics, well, maybe not the basics, but that's that's what we found in our research. But just to reiterate, acceptance has to be cross-cutting across programs and security management, but also beyond that, and that it has to be deliberate and systematic. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Hugo.
Actually, we're going to take a few questions beforehand,
okay.
But no problem. No, thanks. It was really, I mean, you made so many interesting points, and a few of them were taken within the comments in the chat, because people were saying that acceptance was both, really based on relationship, really important, fundamental, that was coming off, and multifaceted. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce it, but you understood it.
Yeah.
But it was also precarious and fragile, based on tolerance, underdone, that it was taking time to achieve. And actually, to build on your questions, so despite the fact that acceptance is so important, as you said, it wasn't really well monitored for a long time. I mean, at least at the time as when you did the research. And we actually have a poll right now to see whether this has changed or not. So the poll is going to appear. Yeah, here it is. So please, participant, can you answer? Does your NGO organization have sufficient guidance on how to maintain and monitor acceptance with local communities? So like this, we're going to be able to have a snapshot. And meanwhile, I'm just going to ask you, what do you think are the barriers and obstacles that prevent NGOs from monitoring acceptance adequately and having a common understanding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think people often get overtaken by events. You know, it becomes something something else that's important, and I guess unless someone in particular or some position, some set of individuals have responsibility for that, it won't necessarily happen. Like so I think that's one of the barriers. And also it requires a lot of time. I just have gone into the Q&A now. And, you know, how do organizations do acceptance? I mean, that was part of what we wanted to document in the research. And so there's a whole toolkit that has a lot of suggestions on how to do that. But I think as part of that very deliberate action to actually do acceptance, and it's not just community meetings, it is you know, actually taking time to listen and speak with people. And I would say listening is hugely important, not just doing. You know, doing is important, but that that listening part of it is really, and then being responsive and being proactive in those responses were, that was quite important. So that was the kind of, those were some of the ways that that organizations did acceptance. But then it requires people. And when there's a lot to do, and when organizations are short-staffed and there's too much to do and not enough time, acceptance, I think, is one of those things that ends up going by the wayside.
Yeah. No, thanks.
So
Thanks for answering.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, the fact that it takes time and that it's really involving being proactive has been noted. And
I would also say, and Hugo probably will talk about this, but it's also really the analysis part of, you know, who's in the community, who are the various stakeholders, is really crucial as well as part of that. So that becomes one way of doing acceptance, is that active analysis. But
yeah, and so in terms of the results for the poll right now, they are quite mixed, but 18% of the participants said that yes, the ranger had sufficient guidance. 51% and the majority said that no, and 31% said somewhat. So pretty mixed.
Yeah. It's although I'm curious to know, I mean, not that we have to do a separate poll, but is it a lack of guidance, or is it a lack of actually doing the work of monitoring and gaining acceptance?
Well, our participants, you're welcome to answer this question in the chat function and share your thoughts there. Then we're going to be moving on to Hugo now, who's going to share a few more thoughts from the ICRC perspective. Hugo, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Leah. Thank you very much, Larissa. I think that yeah, it's an excellent setup. I mean, the question of acceptance, okay, for the ICRCs is really a key pillar of its security management. It's for us very closely linked to the humanitarian principle, especially what we call the NIHA, so this neutrality, independence, and impartiality. They form kind of a package, and of course all those concepts or constructs, if you like, are under pressure for a lot of reasons. For the ICRC, the last few years have been very rough. A lot of big security incidents. We lost a lot of staff. That pushed also, you know, the reflection internally is, okay, can we still, you know, is acceptance still relevant? Is this still something that we should put in our security frame, or should we just bunker down and then take it from there? So, okay, you know, an important point was that no, we think acceptance is still relevant, but we did look very much at you know, where are we in that, and what Larissa just mentioned, and I think this was very interesting in the report, of course, that they had from endorse to consent to tolerate, reject, and target. Okay, this is the sphere where in a way we do find ourselves, and of course here we go beyond the community as such, because the engagement, in a way, if you manage to reach the community, I think that the point raised are very relevant, and I think I totally underscribe the importance of listening. I think it's like a lost art. Okay, we're all of us under pressure. There's donors behind us, all of that, and we think we listen, but really listening is difficult, and we're not necessarily trained for that. And then cross-cultural listening, okay, that's kind of a different story, but it's not what this discussion is about. But so the first thing we say, okay, I think first of all we have to kind of, for us at least, take acceptance off as that's kind of the gold standard. You know, it's almost like an ambition, but you know that you're not really going to get there. So we have to be realistic that where we operate is much more in a sphere of being tolerated. So because, you know, if you work in environments and you know, take you're working somewhere in El Salvador or in Honduras, you know, there's a lot of gangs around you, and you mentioned urban violence, but you can take this into the bigger NAMI regions or wherever. There can be such a splintering of groups, such a level of different interest within those groups, and then the community sits in there, state authorities sit in there. So it's also, again, you know, you're being tolerated or accepted exactly by whom in that entire sphere, which also made us kind of say, okay, this, you know, this is not a, it's not a linear continuum, if you like. It doesn't go from acceptance to rejection or vice versa. We see it almost more like a three-dimensional cube. You know, you can also be all those three things at the same time, if you like. You can be in spaces where you are both rejected, tolerated, and in a way to a certain level accepted at the same time, at times by the same group, you know, because in their hierarchy there's different things. And I think that connects, it connects to I think what you also refer to around tolerance, which is that kind of transactional nature in the end that you also have to recognize. Which isn't a problem. So you have to kind of, you know, be realistic about that. You are bringing something that is of interest, and that means that you have access to an area, and that you might even be able to meet commanders or what have you. But that can also be a very punctual moment. And that can very quickly erode. So, you know, in that cube where you work with those three kind of, you know, axis of acceptance, rejection, and tolerance, that's also not a stagnant box. You know, it's a back and forth continuously where you try to position yourself. And then we can, on top of that, now we have, you know, who is accepted? Is it me, Hugo, is accepted because somehow I create that link because of listening skills or what have you with that group, community, what have you? Or is it the ICRC that I represent? And which again is different. And again, both you can work with. It's just about being able to recognize where you stand in a way in that space, because especially, and again, I take it from a security perspective, if you overestimate your acceptance, if you too easily, you know, kind of say, okay, consent at a certain level or a certain level of understanding for me equates very quickly to acceptance. And then you say, well, if the community is okay, the groups behind it are okay, then you can very quickly fall into a very negative downward trap where you end up with, you know, getting seriously hurt. So, and of course, in a lot of these spaces where we work, you know, the if you like, the economic and at times criminal economic environment in which you step is difficult to read. There's a lot happening under the ground, and again, those are all things that you have to be aware of as you walk, you know, your way into that acceptance scale, because there are a lot of things that are, you know, trapdoors that can take that can take you down. Without you even realizing it. And for me, the main point that I try to pass also to our teams is, you know, of course, everybody individually is in this field to try to do well. And I think the intentions and the work that's put behind it is all to do well. The thing is, what is perceived as good isn't necessarily always on that same spot received as good. And again, because even if you only have a dissenting opinion of 15, they might be a very, very dangerous group with you that can actually destroy everything that you want. So, you know, I prefer people to take sometimes their projects and programs, and I agree that that's absolutely a key element in acceptance, but from the more negative side, okay, explain to me why this is not disrupting. And it's something I've tried to understand a bit, and it's difficult because, okay, it's hard data. I don't have, for example, when I look at my incident statistics, and they go a bit like, you know, like the Swiss mountains that surround me. So it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. You know, we go up, there's needs, so we scale up, the budgets get doubled, tripled, and boom, and I start hitting the big incidents. Okay, we suspend, we go back down again, we reflect, and we go back up. And we have that seesaw movement. And okay, it's trying to see, okay, what happens at those moments? At what point do you break? You know what? And this is the question: is that tolerance break? Often afterwards, you do see that there are small incidents that start to happen, but what changes there? You know, because if I double my budget, is that simply a question of doubling my people, or do I actually at a certain point need to think about, well, I need different people, or I need maybe less people even. I mean, this is the whole question there that okay, I don't have an answer to that, but I'm looking at those charts and I'm seeing the same thing all the time. And it's a question I have, say, what changes there? Because I see that 1 + 1 just simply doesn't add up to 2. It becomes 3, it becomes 5, it can be 7, or at times it stays 1, but there's something in that equation that doesn't add up. And for me around acceptance, okay, that is key. To try to understand. So, okay, we've been trying to work on that, but okay, there is no answer, and I think it also comes out of the poll that you have. I think there are no. I don't have a toolbox where I just say, okay, let's do this, and then we have an answer which I can actually trust. A lot is informal, of course. You use all the things that Larissa mentioned before, the administrative indicators, access, and all of this, informal calls, social media. But even with that, it is very difficult to get a full grasp of it. So it's also afterwards a level of confidence, and then you come more to other issues about informed consent and all of that, that you are easy, you know, that you are honest towards your staff about where you stand, which again, from a security management perspective, for us is very important, as we try to navigate those waters. What we do see is that, because in the past a lot of attention, for example, was on small signals, trying to pick them up. And yes, that's great if you can do it, but we do see that around acceptance, if we walk back some of the events, you know, there were some pretty big elephants in the room that were simply ignored. So it's also to not, you know, not blind yourself to some of the evidences, which can be related to corruption as well, things that you know, at times out of pragmatism maybe are not as stringent on, or you know, depending on your procedures. But it's also behavior, of course, individual behavior that can very quickly, you know, disrupt the way that you are seen. And now it is more complicated in the way that you have, of course, also global communication. And you mentioned here things are being tweeted, and this could be live streamed. You know, who is watching that? Who is picking up those things, and how does that impact again somewhere else your acceptance on the other side of the globe? This is, you know, this goes very fast now, and you have to try to keep your head, you know, above the water there, trying to figure out what's happening. But it is a huge challenge to keep that afloat. I think I'll leave it there. I think it's more interesting for me also to hear questions of the people who are attending. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think you two made some very great points about the transferability of acceptance between individuals and organizations, and who is accepted and who accepts the organization. I think that you also raised, yeah, the fact that NGOs impact the environment, obviously, in which they develop their programs. And I was wondering, what was your opinion on this in general? Do you think that humanitarians insufficiently analyze their impact in the networks, the political, economic, social environment in which they develop their programs? And do you think that considering more the long-term impact of their programs would improve NGOs' acceptance?
Yeah, it's a bit what I think I mentioned before. I think I always compare it to throwing a pebble in a pond. See, it doesn't matter how great my pebble is, I will disrupt. There will be waves. They might be small, they might be bigger. So if your entry point is that you will not disturb because you're bringing a great help for children or for the elderly, and you have the best worked out project with all the indicators and everything done well, I think you're missing a point. And I think that's where maybe the impact is at times very well measured at the program level from a technical perspective. I at times have more questions about, are you looking at, again, who are the potential dissenters on this? And it's also about the road towards. We have these classic problems. We used to have this, for example, and still have this with regard to work in places of detention, not necessarily the most popular activity in countries. Where would you have your problems? At a certain point on the road to that prison, because the communities living beside that or groups, they say, well, you keep giving assistance there, and we need that assistance as well. And that's not necessarily always brought in. And these are that's where I think more than the impact as such, it's more that other impact, which is less visible at times, which I don't think that's being evaluated with the same level of granularity. And it's also not easy. Yeah? I'm not saying it's just something you can just do over, in an hour. That needs a real deep understanding. But I think it also starts with the wanting to see that, you're not just doing good by default.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point. And actually, we're just going to have a quick poll with the audience, building on what you're saying on the scale of acceptance. The question is, currently, would you say that international NGOs are mostly accepted, tolerated, or rejected? I think this is building on your point that oftentimes it can be transactional, and it's at the same time complex because you can be both accepted and rejected by the same group at the same time, depending on the individual to who you ask. Meanwhile, participants answer this poll. I just wanted to ask another question on the roles of humanitarian principles in acceptance. ICRC is obviously a forefront figure in terms of the humanitarian principles and the neutrality. And I feel that in the present environment, there are increasing political pressures from all sides. And I was wondering if you thought that neutrality is still the best way to gain acceptance and to protect staff.
I don't know if it's the best, but I mean, obviously for us, neutrality is a key element. But neutrality, and we discussed it. One thing, neutrality is of course a controversial topic. It's at times seen as participating in things, and neutrality also needs, of course, to be kind of reflected against lack of neutrality, if you like, in a way. So people speaking out allow that an impartial or a neutral entity in the middle of that is at times seen as an asset. Now, it's a segment of that. It's at times a bit old-fashioned, maybe, but I think still believe if you have your neutral, if you're impartial, if you're independent, I think it's maybe acceptance is big, because acceptance kind of hints towards a level of proximity where that is at times a bit more difficult. But at the solid tolerated level, I think yes, because if you play that game well, and that's not easy, because it needs a coherence for a long time across the line by all your people, you will be seen as the least offensive of it. And I think not being seen as a threat for being tolerated is a very important component, because there's a lot of interest in the middle of it. Again, if you go, there's so many places. So if at least already you are not seen as something that threatens that, and that actually sticks exactly to what it says, because you have to hold the line. That's what I said before. You have to come up with, this is this is how we do it, and then you have to exactly do it like that, because people are watching. Yeah, I still think it has a very strong added value to be rather tolerated, but positively tolerated, if you like, if you want to give it a bit more of a positive note.
Okay, thank you. And so results from the polls are up, and 84% of the participants think that NGOs are tolerated, and 14 accepted and 2% rejected. So indeed, tolerance and tolerance seems the word for this webinar. And there was also, I really liked your point, there was also a question related to this as the fact of not being seen as a threat. There was a question around when does acceptance run the risk of endangering the very beneficiaries we are seeking to assist?
I think it's Ian there mentions the point. So I funny enough, yes, being neutral in my view as well is you are equally disliked by all, but not sufficiently to attack you. And that's the point. That's where you find your space. It's that's because yeah, everybody will act against that concept of neutrality because nobody likes that, and it is stubborn. It is not in their interest. But there is a space there that you can work with. But it is a fragile space, and it is again, it's not easy to obtain that.
For sure. So we're now going to move on to more panel discussion. Please continue, all the participants, to keep asking questions in the Q&A function. After the panel, we will open up to questions from the audience. So this will be your chance. On another principle, I actually wanted to start another principle, humanitarian principle, that is less often investigated. It's the principle of humanity. I think in both of your presentation, you highlighted the importance of relationship, listening, building connections, and individuals, which are all based on and relate to the very principle of humanity. And yet it seems that acceptance, acceptance seems very linked to humanity, but it hasn't been very much operationalized and maybe theorized. And so I was wondering if you could tell me what role plays the principle of humanity in NGOs acceptance according to you, and do you think that improving its operationalization would lead to a better acceptance? And maybe we start with Larissa.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually have written some on the principle of humanity as well, but much more, well, in some ways, much more conceptual than practical, at least in contrast to the acceptance work that we did. And what I write in that article is that humanity as such, and this also comes out of my book, not to try and plug that, but just to say it's like been a process, because I've been sort of working in this area for a long time. And it seems to me that humanity as a principle is enacted in everyday actions and relationships. And as such, then it requires, a multitude of things, many of which actually mesh well with acceptance. So one of the things that I write about in that article is that we need to affirm local context and capacity. So it's about, individuals in their social relationships. So it's not just about individuals, but it's about the social networks that people are a part of. But it's also things like going slower rather than being driven by urgency. I think in the humanitarian sector, we are very often driven by or motivated by sort of what is very urgent. And sometimes going a little bit slower might actually allow us to do that listening and then to meet the needs that communities prioritize rather than what we have to offer. So it's about local actors, it's about local responses, who are the local actors in a context, and then also the cultural context, and what are the ways that we either gain or erode our acceptance by not necessarily recognizing the cultural context that we operate in. Another was about adopting vertical and horizontal accountability. Accountability within organizations to staff, things like differential risk profiles, and accounting for those in security risk management, so that it's not just about upward accountability to donors, but also across organizations and downward to those on the receiving end of assistance. things like transparency, providing information, which yeah, we've seen is crucially important for acceptance. And then finally, and this is sort of well, something that many organizations do, but valuing presence and proximity. And that might mean, you know, things like witnessing. That might mean a stance of solidarity for some organizations. Neutrality isn't, as Hugo was saying, it's not necessarily for everyone. And so maybe some organizations, you know, are better off with a stance of solidarity that becomes a way of gaining acceptance. Maybe not gaining acceptance from all sides, but from at least one side. So, you know, being present with the emphasis on the word being as opposed to doing, or things like walking alongside. In some research that I've done for the Humanitarian Policy Group, you know, it identified communities don't always want things necessarily. They don't necessarily want non-food items. They might just want people to accompany them in really difficult situations of violence and conflict. That isn't necessarily enough for everyone, but some organizations should be doing that. And to me, that's about humanity as a principle. So,
yeah, no, thanks a lot. I think you make a strong point about the fact that potentially we need to slow down to better operationalize humanity. And that reminds me of other comments that were saying that, yeah, for acceptance, you have to work for it and you have to take the time for it. And it's also interesting, the semantic changes between being and doing. I think it raises, yeah, important differences in the way humanitarian work is being done. Hugo, maybe would you like to share your thoughts on the operationalization of humanity?
I mean, it's why we're all there, no? So, I mean, it is the kind of the foundation of it all. Then, okay, within that, of course, everybody has their mandates and all of that. But I mean, this is the entry point for each individual when he or she reaches out to anyone. And then whether that's a community, whether that's a stakeholder, an armed group, the military, or, you know, prisoners. I mean, in the end, even, and this is of course more controversial, but for us, as we want to walk on all sides, you know, the challenge is always to find that element of humanity in each person, even the people that you might find at times grotesque. Because it's yeah, for where the ICRC comes from, it is absolutely essential. Again, that comes back to that neutrality principle, but humanity underlies it all. And then, yeah, if I just take back what Larissa said, I think this complementarity of actors, because one isn't better than the other. It is to try to fill that palette of options, because communities and everybody need different kind of approaches. And there's mentioned that certain things need to be said, and questions have to be asked. Yes, that has to be done, just not by everybody the same way. And this is where I think also for a donor community, you know, you need to insist on that, you know, that dynamic spectrum of actors in order to fill all of the different needs which are out there. So for as much that links to humanity, yes, it is key. It's also where your credibility lies. If you can't show that in a way as a humanitarian organization, at least, why are you there?
Yeah, thanks for your comments. It's very good points as well. Maybe then just a follow-up questions on some more the operationalization, moving between this sort of the theory of humanity and of acceptance and the practice of acceptance. I feel that in your research paper, Larissa, so you emphasize on the human skills, and Hugo, you mentioned as well, they need to do some to be better at listening and potentially to be trained for listening. So I was wondering what were your thoughts in terms of the best practices of acceptance and the skills required by NGO staff to do good acceptance? And maybe Hugo, if you want to start.
Best practices. I mean, I think a lot is done. I think people do try to make that genuine attempt towards proximity and all of that. Yeah, the listening is is a challenge. I mean, it's like, you know, speak 10% and listen 90%. It's difficult for me to speak on behalf of all of NGOs what is good practice. I know within ICRC, if I keep that as the limited frame that I have, I mean, there is, people try to reach out there. We tried with diversity, you try with types of programming, you try with reaching out to all kinds of platforms to get as much, you know, the needs really as people feel them. But then, okay, you find yourself, of course, in stuck in also bureaucracy, which means that, you know, delivery times and all of that often are very long for communities, especially if you're talking about slightly bigger programs. But even for simple things, anti-terrorist legislation, all of that might just slow you down tremendously. So, you know, I think the good practices are to continue like that. Try to work a little bit more on understanding really, you know, where you disrupt. For the rest, I don't have, you know, too much to add there. I think the practices right now are not bad, and I think that's also why what Larissa has written 10 years ago, I think a lot of those questions still stand, but also a lot of the indicators, all of that for me still are relevant with regard to communities. And those have been picked up because people are working with those to the extent that they have the resources to do so.
Yeah. Thanks. Larissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started the work, there was almost nothing other than sort of GPR8. There was like no sort of real guidance on what acceptance, how to do acceptance, and so there was, you know, some people talked about passive acceptance and active acceptance, and what we argued in part through the research was that you know, there is no such thing as passive acceptance. It's a misnomer. And so I guess I would say, you know, part of the disconnect between theory and practice is really about making it deliberate and systematizing it. One of the questions that came through in the chat or in the Q&A was, you know, how do you monitor it? Or like, where do you put it? And, you know, maybe one way to break down the silo is the silos between programming and security management is that you monitor acceptance as part of your programming. And that becomes something that you do because everybody monitors their programming activities and their program impact for donors. And so maybe as part of that, you add in questions about acceptance, and that becomes another way. It won't get to all of your stakeholders because obviously your analysis will identify people beyond just your those who, you know, are part of your programs, who you need to also work at, but that would be one way of sort of breaking down some of those silos. So I think it's about finding ways to systematize some of the work of acceptance, which of course is easier said than done. But I think working at that is one of the ways to then sort of address that theory practice gap, sort of.
Great, thank you. And maybe moving on to now looking at the future of acceptance. Before opening up to the Q&A, everyone please ask questions. I wanted to ask both of you, what were to your mind the future challenges to acceptance or future elements that will mainly impact acceptance and force NGOs to act in different ways? So one question mentioned coronavirus, obviously. So Larissa, maybe do you want to start on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the back of our research, we identified like the really challenging context that we thought would be urban areas, where you have different kinds of community networks that may not be as established. So that was one of the ones that we identified as a challenge for acceptance. Also areas with high criminality will be, which may be urban, but not necessarily. So those are both difficult contexts. And then I think more recently, I would also add pandemics to that. So the question about COVID, I think is, I think it will change together with, because I think from organizations' perspectives, like the fear is that aid workers bring COVID into a community, and that then obviously creates issues for acceptance because people are fearful. And I think that coupled with sort of the decolonization and anti-racism in the, in the aid world, I think those are going to become really difficult questions that organizations are going to have to grapple with in terms of acceptance. Like, how do some of those questions then affect the way you operate in communities? Because as Hugo was saying earlier, your acceptance in one context can very much affect your acceptance in, a country halfway around the world or all the way around the world. And so your stances on some of these issues, I think, will inevitably then, in addition to things like counterterrorism, they will affect the way that you are accepted or tolerated or rejected in a community.
Yeah, I think these are all good points. And for the localization, I was recently talking with national SFP who is telling me that following coronavirus, the fact that expats have left, there will also be a need to look at how the return of expats in local offices is going to be organized, and acceptance within the organization between international and national staff.
Yeah, so, sort of that horizontal accountability, I think, is going to be crucial. And then also, in some ways, your entry and your exit strategies are then also become important. Yeah.
And maybe you go now?
Yes, I think those are very relevant in the element of stigma. I think certainly around these pandemics, we saw it Ebola as well, are very complicated to manage. So they will be challenging, and the risk that these type of events will continue to produce themselves, because of course they're already there for a long time. But now COVID is really a global one, but you have had many, and people will be more aware of that. And with global communication, they'll possibly be more fearful. So if you are falling into a nationality or category that is perceived as being infected by that, yeah, that's not gonna help. Yeah, the decolonization or the racism debate, of course, very important. They pose a big question or a big problem in a way that we've always tried to avoid. And me, for example, I want the ICRC to be recognized, and anybody who represents it. It doesn't matter the nationality. Of course, ICRC came from a very strong Swiss background and is essentially a Swiss organization with an international mandate. But by going to a very stronger compartmentalization by religion, race, nationality, all of that, of course, it complicates enormously in trying to position yourself in that acceptance field, because you have, again, many more factors to keep in mind. So that will certainly be a challenge, I think, to see how to manage that responsibly. Well, polarization in general, you see that there is a very strong trend also by states to control more these things, to also be in charge of humanitarian aid. So this is also, in a way, the more negative part of localization, if you like. And these elements will be challenging because, again, trying to be accepted is at times a challenge for these kind of programs, where they are very heavily nationalistic and they don't want any of that. And what, the way we see things going now is that trend is certainly not not reducing. A challenge as well is simply the quantity of actors and information to digest. I think this is, you know, you got so much coming your way, trying to make sense of all of that is a huge challenge. And again, it takes resources, and if you do not have those resources, okay, it is almost impossible to do that. We see that also throughout the crisis. It's really a major issue. Okay, and by having these challenges, of course, around acceptance, okay, by default, in a way, your proximity will deteriorate. So how can you keep that proximity level up? That I think is also, anyway, something that we'll have to look at and see, you know, how we can do this. And then finally, okay, it's and this is especially in armed conflict, it links to the fragmentation. Of course, you have a lot of proxies now. There's a lot of states using, if we take Libya now, if of course the conflicts also in Syria and Iraq, and those are challenges to manage as well, because your acceptance is not controlled at the level of where you are talking to the person. There's people behind it that pull the trigger, and they are much more impersonal. So if you don't know those, or if your relationship there isn't good, it might still lead to major problems in the front. And that's, for example, also what you see with crime. In a way, criminal entities, you can reach out to those, but it is the whole frame around it which makes it illegal, which makes it so much more complicated. Like with groups that are on the terrorist list and all of that, there's a whole frame there. And by making it so complicated, okay, also your capacity to reach a level of dialogue that might sustain a bit more solid tolerance is often very complicated. And that is, unfortunately, I don't think going to go away.
Well, actually, building on both of your points, we have a first question which asks about to what degrees have certain large-scale, high-profile, globally published scandals across the aid sector affected NGOs' ability to gain acceptance in the world's most challenging humanitarian environments? And how can we go about generating and maintaining acceptance if we're perceived as being perpetrators of scandals capable of behaving without humanity? I think this is, building on the points you both made around the interconnection between the non actor and the globalization of humanitarian action. Who would like to start answering this good question?
I mean, I can start. I mean, obviously the scandals like the Oxfam scandal, ongoing discussions, and there's often smaller scandals, if you like, more around, for example, corruption or fraud. Yes, they have a certain impact. I must say, okay, the people that we serve are so much busy trying to survive in many places that is not necessarily their top priority always in it. So the impact is there, but it becomes a discussion point, and it can become a pressure point. And then it depends, of course, how far you yourself as an organization were involved in some of these events in a specific context. So this is, of course, what makes it also much more complicated. But yes, all those things need to be integrated. And where you see them very quickly coming back is in discourses of armed groups, for example, especially the ones with global reach, you know, who already anyway are not necessarily on your side, and that of course impacts also communities which they control, or where they have a very regular presence.
Larissa, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Hugo said. I mean, I think that, again, that was one of the things we observed in the research, was that it's much harder to sort of gain acceptance and then maintain it. It's much easier to just erode it, to have it one action of even sometimes a single staff member who, I remember one example of, a staff member who ended up speaking very disrespectfully to a local, a member of the local authorities. And that ended up then having ramifications for the organization's acceptance. And, you know, even those kinds of things can have an outsized effect on acceptance. So then when you think about these sort of global scandals that of all kinds, it does make it more difficult. I think then it adds extra impetus, importance on the, you know, ensuring that the way that you do your programming is respectful, is, you know, meets the needs of communities, that you're providing quality programming, and to take, you know, to take that as part of your way of countering some of these scandals. I don't know, it's not, you know, it's a really difficult question to answer because there is no easy answer. I mean, the bottom line is it affects things in ways that make it much more difficult to operate. Yeah, sort of a cop-out, but.
No, great, thanks. There is actually a related comment made by O'Neill, if I found it, by Neil, to which you could react. He's explaining that acceptance has to be coordinated across the humanitarian community, as it does not work if it's just done on a one-on-one basis and localized, and give the example of Syrian government area and Yemen. And I was thinking that it's also hinging on your earlier comments about when does acceptance also does not work and fail because it is simply not the right environment, or the environment is just too complex, or the actors are just too complex to do acceptance with. So maybe if you would like to react to this comment.
Maybe I'll take a crack at it first and let Hugo come after. I guess, yeah, I mean, acceptance can be something that is very much affected by, you know, other organizations. And so the idea of sort of distinguishing your organization from other organizations may be one of the ways that you choose to work at acceptance, and to try and do that more deliberately, which is easier for some organizations, I think, than it is for others. But also to say that acceptance doesn't always work. It's, you know, again, most of the people on this call will be much more aware of that in much closer ways than I am, but, you know, it's not a panacea. It doesn't always work. Just as protection doesn't always work, just as deterrence doesn't always work. But it is sort of, it is in part, I think, what sets the NGO world apart and the humanitarian world apart. So, yeah, and in that way, I do think, you know, it is very much across organizations and part of a sort of our sector, but also individual. But like I said, distinction then might be one approach to actually try and maintain your acceptance, even in the context of places where it's really difficult.
Thank you. Hugo, do you want to share any thoughts on this?
No, I don't think they do. Well, I mean, okay. A little bit. Of course, the humanitarian principles are there in a way to have a coherent approach across the board. That is in that kind of overall desire to what Neil said. Okay, yes, obviously, ideally, everybody plays the game in a similar way, because yes, it does impact. You know, I remember being after the Haiyan superstorm, and after a month, if you know, after the first response, you were driving out, and I see like 1 million flags of an organization that had no idea. So nobody knows who that is, you know. I mean, we know, not even, but nobody else there that lives there that needs help knows any of that. So obviously, if my people behave badly, then, you know, it'll very quickly go around, and it can have impact on the work of Plan, or it can have the impact on the World of Save Children. So in a way, the humanitarian principles should help there. At the same time, okay, you also have to create your level of distinction in order to create your own space, because you cannot control that entire environment. And it is an ideal world where everybody would work, but I have troubles already getting my own staff, for example, aligned. And I think I mentioned it before. I mean, it takes a level of discipline in people's minds. This is why ICRC in the past was always seen like, for example, the Vatican. And because you had people that kept all saying the same thing. You say, okay, but they're all robots. You know? But it is unfortunately, in a way, what you need if you want to maintain that space there in the most extreme environments. So it's not everywhere, but in the most extreme environments where you are very, very much watched, yes. And that I cannot stretch beyond anywhere else. So I need to have the capacity also to opt out in a way, by creating a level of distinctiveness, trying to have population understand that, okay, I'm not the others. But finding the right balance in there is the challenge.
Yeah, well then maybe a follow-up questions on then having your thoughts on the humanitarian peace development nexus and integrated missions where NGOs collaborate increasingly with the UN or other actors, and how does this impact acceptance?
Okay, for me but then as ICRC, I stand in a very specific part in that response, but that's for us the huge no-go. And yes, it causes problems. I mean, I've seen it from when they started with the PRTs in Afghanistan back in the day to integrated missions in Africa and all of that. And I understand those, and they have their merit. But from, again, in that concept of a neutrality and impartial mission, and at times even humanity, okay, it creates a tension field, which can easily create problems. And where there I have to really, there we have to actively work to be distinct from that effort, and invest considerable resources in doing so, because the confusion is there immediately.
Larissa?
Yeah, I find I definitely think it can create challenges for acceptance. I also think that, you know, part of what the quote unquote nexus should be at its core is about good programming that is conflict aware, that is, you know, that both takes into account the current context, is, you know, is responding to people's needs, that also, you know, has that kind of longer term awareness, because you know, anymore, even though I mean, humanitarian crises are protracted, and, you know, humanitarians are there for decades, often. And so then if we're not also paying attention to the conflict dynamics, then it, you know, will be there for decades since, or, you know, hence. So in that way, to me, that could be part and parcel of really effective programming, that, you know, looks at these various elements, maybe doesn't try to do them all. And I do think there is a space for different kinds of action in those. But I think, you know, being conflict aware, being aware of the environment, is really crucial, and taking that into account.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience, so I think we will leave it here unless anyone has any other thoughts to share. Actually, for the participants, we would be interested from a research viewpoint to get your opinion on what are the next biggest challenges for acceptance. So please do share your thoughts in the chat, because we will then read them. So thanks again to both of you, our amazing panelists. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and it is a complicated topic to address, but I think you really touched on core questions. So thank you again for this. Now, for all the others, if you're interested into by contributing to your research project, please reach out to us after the summer, because then before then we will be busy or on holidays. So Great. Well, thank you again to everyone and for your participation. And don't forget to fill the poll that just came up.